There comes a quiet moment in the journey of awakening that almost no one prepares you for, because it cannot be explained by the language of striving or success or self-improvement. It arrives softly, without drama, without fireworks, without the applause of the world. It feels like standing in an open field after a storm has passed, when the air is so still that even your thoughts seem to pause out of respect. In that moment, you may notice something that startles you, not fear, not sadness, but a gentle absence. A sense that the old urgency to be someone, to be known, to be defined, has simply loosened its grip. And the mind, which has been trained to label everything, might whisper, "This feels like I don't want to exist anymore." But that whisper misunderstands what is happening. This is not a desire to leave life. It is a remembrance that you were never confined to the narrow idea of a self in the first place. When awakening deepens, the ego does not disappear in a dramatic collapse. It fades like a shadow at dusk. You don't fight it, you don't defeat it. It simply becomes unnecessary. The stories you once carried so tightly, who you are, what you've been through, what you must become, begin to feel heavy, like clothing worn long after the season has changed. And in that shedding, there can be a strange, beautiful emptiness. Not the emptiness of lack, but the emptiness of spaciousness. Like an empty cup that is finally ready to be filled with something far greater than the noise of identity. This is where many people become confused. They have spent their entire lives believing that existence requires constant effort, constant proof, constant reinforcement. The ego has convinced them that to exist is to perform, to compare, to defend, to accumulate. So when that machinery quiets down, the nervous system searches for something to cling to. The mind asks, if I am not striving, who am I? If I am not chasing meaning, what is my purpose? If I no longer feel the need to announce myself to the world, do I still matter? And the answer, spoken not in words but in awareness, is profoundly simple. You matter more than ever, because you are no longer confusing your worth with your noise. There is a sacred misunderstanding that happens at this stage. People think awakening should feel like constant bliss, endless joy, perpetual inspiration. But awakening is not an emotional high. It is a release from emotional dependency. It is not about feeling more. It is about needing less. Less validation, less approval, less explanation, less resistance to what is. And when the need to exist as a separate, defended entity dissolves, what remains is not nothing. What remains is life itself, moving through you without obstruction. Imagine a river that has been dammed for years by beliefs, fears, and labels. The water is still there, but it is constrained, controlled, forced into narrow channels. When awakening occurs, the dam does not explode. It is quietly removed. And suddenly the river flows as it was always meant to flow, wide, effortless, unconcerned with its own name. The river does not wake up each morning asking if it deserves to exist. It does not compare itself to other rivers. It does not cling to its past path. It simply flows. And in that flowing, it nourishes everything it touches. This is the stage where the soul begins to recognize itself beyond form. You start to sense that what you truly are cannot be captured by a role, a title, a personality, or even a spiritual identity. You are not the thinker of thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts arise and dissolve. You are not the body, you are the life animating it. You are not the story, you are the silence that remains when the story rests. And when this recognition settles in, there can be a deep longing not to disappear from the world, but to stop pretending to be separate from it. The ego resists this stage because it survives on distinction. It needs edges, it needs boundaries, it needs a me and a them. Awakening softens those edges. You begin to feel less like a fragment and more like a field. Less like a wave struggling against other waves and more like the ocean expressing itself in countless forms. And the ego interprets this as annihilation because it cannot comprehend unity. But the soul recognizes it as homecoming. There is great healing in realizing that you do not need to announce your existence to justify it. The sun does not wake up and declare its importance. The flower does not apologize for blooming. The stars do not compete for attention in the night sky. They simply are. And in their being, they serve the whole. When you stop trying to exist as an idea and allow yourself to exist as presence, life begins to move through you with a natural intelligence that requires no effort. This is why the emptiness you feel after awakening is not something to be feared. It is the empty space left behind when the false self steps aside. It is the silence after the mind has exhausted its arguments. It is the pause between breaths where peace lives. And in that emptiness, you may notice a tenderness, a gentleness, a compassion that was always there but drowned out by the noise of becoming. You listen more. You react less. You love without agenda. You forgive without keeping score. You no longer need to be right because being right was never the point. At this stage, forgiveness becomes effortless, not because you approve of what happened, but because you see that holding resentment requires a rigid self to protect. When that rigidity softens, there is nothing left to defend. You understand deeply and without spiritual bypassing that resentment is a story the ego tells to justify its separation. And when separation dissolves, resentment loses its foundation. There are no justified resentments because there is no isolated self that needs justification. Living in the now ceases to be a practice and becomes a natural state. Not because you force yourself to stay present, but because the past no longer defines you and the future no longer controls you. You realize that the only place life has ever been willing to meet you is here, in this breath, in this moment, in this awareness. And when you rest here, truly rest, the compulsion to escape existence falls away. You do not want to disappear. You want to arrive fully without the burden of who you thought you had to be. This is the paradox of awakening. The less you try to exist as someone, the more alive you feel as everything. The less you cling to identity, the more authentic your expression becomes. You stop performing life and start participating in it. You speak when there is something true to say, not when silence threatens your sense of importance. You act when action is aligned, not when restlessness demands movement. You trust the intelligence that beats your heart and grows the trees and turns the planets without ever consulting the ego. And in this trust, a deep inner freedom emerges. Freedom from the need to prove. Freedom from the fear of disappearing. Freedom from the belief that your value depends on visibility. You understand that you are already enough, not because you have achieved something, but because you are an expression of the same creative force that animates all life. Nothing in nature strives to be worthy. It simply fulfills its function. And your function, at the deepest level, is to be conscious, loving presence in whatever form life chooses to express through you. So if you find yourself in this quiet stage where the desire to exist as a separate self is fading, do not rush to label it or fix it. Do not mistake peace for emptiness or silence for absence. This is not a withdrawal from life. It is an intimacy with life. You are learning to live without the armor of ego, without the noise of constant self-reference. You are discovering that you do not need to disappear to be free. You only need to let go of who you were never meant to be. And as you rest in this understanding, life will continue, simpler, truer, lighter. You will still laugh, still create, still love, still serve. But you will do so without the invisible weight of identity pressing down on every moment. You will exist, yes, but not as a problem to be solved or a story to be defended. You will exist as presence itself, quietly, powerfully, unmistakably alive, flowing with the same wisdom that has always known exactly how to be. And as this quiet unfolding continues, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. You notice that life no longer feels like a task you must complete or a puzzle you must solve. It feels more like a melody you are listening to from the inside. You are not outside the music trying to understand it. You are inside it, moving as it moves, resting when it rests, rising when it rises. The old urgency to control the rhythm fades, and with it goes the fear that something essential might be lost if you stop trying. You begin to sense, perhaps for the first time, that nothing real has ever depended on your effort to hold it together. This is where the mind may attempt one last subtle maneuver. It may say, if I no longer strive, will I become passive? If I stop defining myself, will I disappear into nothingness? But awareness smiles gently at these questions because it knows the truth that words struggle to carry. You are not dissolving into nothing. You are dissolving into everything. The drop does not lose itself when it falls into the ocean. It loses only the illusion that it was ever separate from the ocean in the first place. And in this realization, there is a deep compassion that begins to awaken not just for others, but for yourself. You look back at the years spent proving, striving, defending, and you no longer judge them harshly. You see them as necessary steps, as the costume the soul wore while learning how to remember itself. You forgive yourself for the moments you tried too hard, for the times you believed you had to earn love, for the years you mistook exhaustion for purpose. Forgiveness here is not an act, it is a recognition that you were always doing the best you could with the level of awareness available at the time. As identity loosens, you may notice that emotions still arise, but they pass through more freely. Sadness no longer feels like a threat to your existence. Joy no longer needs to be captured or prolonged. Fear may still knock on the door, but it no longer takes over the house. You have learned something essential. Feelings are weather, not the sky. Thoughts are visitors, not residents. And you, at your core, are the spaciousness that allows all of it to come and go without being diminished. This is where healing truly deepens. Not the healing that fixes a broken self, but the healing that reveals there was never anything broken at all. You begin to understand that much of what you called suffering was resistance to what is. A refusal to let life be as it is in this moment. When resistance dissolves, suffering loses its grip. Pain may still arise, but it is no longer layered with the story of why me, or this shouldn't be happening. It becomes sensation, information, movement, nothing more, nothing less. You start to live with a quiet reverence for ordinary moments, the way light enters a room, the sound of your own breathing, the simple presence of another human being without needing to extract anything from them. You realize that enlightenment was never about transcending life, it was about finally inhabiting it fully, honestly, without the filter of who you thought you were supposed to be. At this stage, the desire not to exist transforms itself into something far more accurate. The desire not to pretend you are separate, not to pretend you are incomplete, not to pretend you must constantly become something else to justify your presence here. You see that existence does not require effort, it requires allowance. Life is already happening, awareness is already present, love is already flowing. The only thing that ever stood in the way was the belief that you had to manage it all. And so you begin to trust, not blindly, not naively, but deeply. You trust the same intelligence that digests your food without instruction, that heals a wound without your involvement, that orchestrates the vast movements of the universe without ever asking your permission. You stop micromanaging your own becoming. You allow yourself to be lived by something wiser than the thinking mind. This is not surrender as defeat, it is surrender as alignment. In this alignment, your actions become simpler and more powerful. You speak from clarity rather than compulsion. You help not to feel needed, but because compassion naturally expresses itself when there is no ego blocking the flow. You rest without guilt. You say no without explanation. You say yes without fear. You no longer need life to look a certain way in order to feel at peace, because peace is no longer dependent on conditions. And perhaps most quietly miraculous of all, love changes its shape. It is no longer something you fall into and out of. It is no longer something you barter for or protect. Love becomes your natural state of perception. You see others not as roles or projections, but as expressions of the same consciousness looking back at itself through different eyes. This does not make you detached. It makes you profoundly intimate with life. You feel connected without clinging. You care without controlling. You give without losing yourself. So when the mind returns to that old phrase, the desire not to exist, you can meet it with gentleness and understanding. You can hear what it is really saying. It is not asking for annihilation. It is asking for truth. It is asking for rest from the exhausting job of being someone. It is asking to lay down the mask and breathe as awareness itself. And here, in this breath, in this moment, you discover that you are not disappearing at all. You are arriving as presence, arriving as peace, arriving as the quiet knowing that you are not a fragment struggling through a hostile world, but an expression of a living, intelligent universe learning to experience itself through form. You exist, yes, but not as a story that must be maintained. You exist as the space in which all stories appear and fade. You exist as the stillness beneath movement, the silence beneath sound, the love beneath every form of fear. And in this realization, the longing to dissolve the false self is fulfilled, not by leaving life, but by finally living it, without resistance, without pretense, and without the weight of an identity that was never truly you. And as you settle even more deeply into this way of being, something profoundly stabilizing begins to take root. The quiet is no longer unfamiliar. The stillness no longer feels like a void that needs to be filled. It becomes a trusted companion, a gentle presence that reminds you that nothing essential is missing. You notice that when the mind grows silent, life does not stop. In fact, it becomes richer, more textured, more alive. Without the constant narration of the ego, experience feels direct, immediate, unfiltered. Colors seem softer yet more vivid. Sounds arrive without interpretation. Moments unfold without needing to be named. You begin to understand that awareness does not need content to justify itself. Silence is not the absence of life. It is the field from which life arises. And in that field, you are held without effort. This is where the soul exhales. This is where the nervous system learns that it is safe to rest. Safe to stop scanning for threats. Safe to stop proving worth. Safe to stop asking, am I enough? Because the question itself has dissolved. At this stage, the idea of identity starts to feel almost quaint, like an old coat you once wore out of habit rather than necessity. You can still put it on when life calls for it. You can function, speak, choose, respond, but you are no longer inside it. You wear identity lightly, like a role in a play you know is temporary. And because you are no longer confused about who you are no longer afraid of losing who you are. There is an enormous freedom in this. A freedom that does not announce itself loudly, but quietly transforms everything. You may notice that time feels different now. The past no longer pulls at you with the same emotional gravity. The future no longer feels like a cliff you must constantly prepare to jump from. Time becomes something you move through, not something that moves against you. You realize that most suffering was never about what happened, but about the story you carried forward and rehearsed endlessly. When the storyteller rests, the story loosens. And in that loosening, the present moment reveals itself as more than enough. This is where gratitude begins to arise without effort. Not gratitude as a practice, not gratitude as a list, but gratitude as a natural response to seeing clearly. You are grateful not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer arguing with reality. You are grateful because you see how much energy was once spent resisting what is, and how little is required now to simply allow life to unfold. Even challenges are met differently. They are no longer enemies to defeat or obstacles to resent. They are movements within consciousness, passing experiences that no longer define you. You start to sense that the soul always knew this, that beneath every search, every ambition, every attempt to become something, there was a quiet knowing whispering, you don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to add anything. You don't need to fix yourself to belong here. Awakening is not the acquisition of wisdom. It is the removal of what was never true. It is the peeling away of assumptions until only what is real remains. And what remains is astonishingly simple. Presence, awareness, being, not as concepts, but as lived reality. You are here, breathing, sensing, aware. Nothing more is required. The desire to disappear dissolves because you realize you were never trapped in existence to begin with. You were trapped in an idea about existence. And now that idea has loosened, softened, faded. There is a deep humility that comes with this recognition. You no longer feel the need to elevate yourself above others or compare your awakening to anyone else's path. You see that every being is moving at the exact pace required for their own remembering. Judgment fades because judgment requires separation. Superiority fades because it was built on insecurity. What remains is respect for life, for timing, for the intelligence that moves through all things. In this space, service becomes effortless. You no longer help others to feel valuable or needed. You help because love moves naturally when it is unobstructed. Sometimes that help is action. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is simply being fully present with another human being without trying to fix them. You understand now that presence itself is healing. That being deeply with someone, without agenda or projection, is one of the greatest gifts you can offer. And so the awakening continues, not upward, not outward, but inward and inward still, deeper into simplicity, deeper into truth, deeper into the realization that you are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Life no longer feels like something happening to you. It feels like something happening as you, through you, with you. You rest more often now, not because you are tired, but because you no longer believe rest must be earned. You allow joy when it comes and let it go when it leaves. You allow sadness without building an identity around it. You allow uncertainty without demanding immediate answers. You trust the unfolding, even when the path is unclear, because you have seen what happens when you stop interfering with the natural intelligence of life. And quietly, gently, without fanfare, you realize that this was always the point, not to become extraordinary, but to remember the ordinariness that is sacred. Not to transcend humanity, but to inhabit it fully without the burden of ego. Not to stop existing, but to stop resisting existence as it is. You are here, you are aware, you are alive, and nothing else needs to be added to make this moment complete. And with this balance, something settles that feels almost like gravity returning in a gentler form. You are not floating away from life, you are landing inside it. The earlier sense of dissolving, of thinning out, now reveals its deeper purpose. It was never meant to leave you ungrounded. It was meant to clear the noise so that you could finally feel the quiet solidity of being, not the heaviness of obligation, but the steadiness of presence. You discover that awakening does not remove you from the world. It places you more firmly within it, but without the friction of resistance. You begin to sense a rhythm to this unfolding. Expansion followed by grounding. Silence followed by engagement. Stillness followed by movement. The ego once tried to control this rhythm, insisting that growth must always look like forward motion, upward motion, constant motion. Now you see that life breathes, just as you do. There is an in-breath of awareness, a retreat into quiet, and there is an out-breath of expression, action, and relationship. Balance is not something you manufacture. It is something you allow by no longer interfering. At this stage, the fear of losing yourself gives way to a surprising realization. You were never truly present before. You are always leaning into the next moment or bracing against the last. Now, presence has weight. It has texture. You feel yourself inhabiting your body without needing to escape it. Sensation is no longer a distraction from spirituality. It is an entry point into it. The simple act of standing, walking, breathing becomes intimate, sacred, whole. You also begin to notice that clarity does not demand certainty. The ego was addicted to answers, to definitions, to conclusions. Awareness is comfortable with openness. You no longer rush to name what is happening or to fit it into a spiritual framework. You trust that understanding unfolds in layers and that not knowing is not a failure but a doorway. Mystery stops being threatening and starts feeling like companionship. Life does not need to be solved to be lived. Here, compassion deepens again, but this time it is balanced with discernment. You do not absorb everything. You do not rescue everyone. You do not sacrifice your inner stillness to meet the chaos of the world. Instead, you meet life from center. You engage without entanglement. You care without collapsing. You give without depletion. This is not detachment. It is alignment. You are learning how to remain rooted in awareness while participating fully in human experience. You see now why the earlier longing to disappear arose. It was the psyche's way of saying, I cannot continue at this pace of self-definition. It was not a rejection of life, but a rejection of fragmentation. And now, as integration occurs, that longing softens into something more mature, more embodied. A quiet willingness to be here without armor, to exist without commentary, to live without the constant inner narration of who you are supposed to be. Balance also reveals itself in how you relate to thought. You do not silence the mind, you befriend it. Thoughts come and go, but they no longer dictate your identity. You use the mind when it is useful and set it down when it is not. There is no war within you anymore. No part of you is being pushed away in the name of spirituality. Everything is included. Nothing is idolized. This inclusion is what creates stability. You may notice that your sense of purpose shifts here. Purpose is no longer a destination you are racing toward. It becomes a quality you bring to whatever is in front of you. Presence becomes purpose. Integrity becomes purpose. Kindness becomes purpose. You stop asking, what am I meant to do with my life? And start living in a way that lets life express itself through you naturally. And in doing so, you often find yourself doing exactly what is needed without strain. This is where awakening matures. It stops being an inner event and becomes a way of living. You pay attention, you listen, you respond rather than react. You notice when you are drifting into old patterns and gently return without judgment, without drama. Balance is maintained not through effort, but through awareness. Awareness notices imbalance before it becomes suffering. And so the journey continues, not as a dramatic ascent or a final arrival, but as a living, breathing equilibrium. You are awake enough to see through illusion, grounded enough to live in form, humble enough to keep learning, and present enough to keep loving. The ego is no longer the driver, but it has not been exiled. It has been re-educated. It serves rather than rules. You no longer want to disappear, and you no longer need to assert yourself. You simply remain open, available, rooted. And in this remaining, life flows through you with a quiet confidence that does not seek recognition. You are here fully, without excess and without lack. The plot does not rush forward or collapse inward. It breathes, and you breathe with it. Balance between being and becoming, silence and expression, emptiness and form, exactly where you are meant to be.